The problem with tariffs for most e-commerce sellers was never really how much the tariff was, and rather the uncertainty whether it was just the start of something that was going to get a lot worse, or it was the tippity top of what it would be. And thankfully, at least for the EU and US, we now have an end in sight for that. So what am I talking about? Well, the EU and US recently came on a framework trade deal ending months of uncertainty. So essentially, again, that uncertainty I think is where a lot of people didn't like all of the tariff situation because they had no idea whether it's the EU, whether it's China, or anywhere else, if it was going to get any worse than it already was. And it seemed like a lot of times it was. But with this deal, almost all EU goods entering the US will be subject to a 15% baseline tariff. So we are now stuck at a just consistent 15% tariff on most everything, almost being the big keyword within this sentence, where the 15% tariff is the maximum tariff and is not added to any existing rates. I think that's a very crucial aspect, just because, as you know, with a lot of the China tariffs, the percentage that we are adding is being added on to all of the current rates. It is not just a set in standard stone rate with all of the ones we are doing with China. Instead, China, we are setting them on top of all of the standard ones. This with the EU just sets that 15% as the maximum for all EU goods, which is, in my opinion, better at the end of the day. Now, going on from this, the primary things when it comes to e-commerce sellers, in my opinion, would be the idea that this also affects natural resources and critical raw materials, more products to be added, essentially. So why is that part especially important for e-commerce sellers? Well, I think the big reason it's really important is because of the aspect that we still have the tariffs across the board for China, as well as many other countries. But one of the big aspects behind the tariffs is the idea of trying to bring manufacturing back into the US. And so the big problem with bringing manufacturing into the US is that we don't have a lot of raw materials. At the end of the day, raw materials are just not something that the US has an abundance of. In fact, that's one of the reasons that we typically are buying so many things from China and from other countries, because they have a lot of raw materials. But this is one of those areas where I think we could see that in the next few years, more manufacturing coming into the US, and it's a good time if you are an e-commerce seller to try and start to look at the future for bringing your manufacturing onshore. Now, is that feasible for every single product? No, it just isn't at the end of the day. But I think for a lot of products out there, it could potentially be feasible and still fit within a good profitability and COGS model. Now, having natural resources and critical raw materials from the EU, I think, is a big step forward within this for e-commerce sellers, but it is not the only step forward that is obviously needed at the end of the day. The other aspect of this that I did notice as well is that things such as tariffs on European steel and aluminum will stay at 50%. Again, that's one of those big areas where we already have a lot of manufacturing for that, so it makes sense as to why it's not going to be, coming from Europe in any way, or the EU. And on top of that, the EU pledged to make $750 billion in strategic purchases, covering oil, natural gas, nuclear, fuel, and chips during President Donald Trump's second term in office. So that's one of the more interesting things now. Is this really going to cover or affect many e-commerce sellers? Unlikely, as most e-commerce sellers are probably not selling one of those categories, but it is showing that there is going to be a vested interest in trade between the EU and the US moving forward. So, in my opinion, as an e-commerce seller, this is kind of a really good time to look at expanding. If you have not done global expansion, you have not gone into the UK, into the EU, I think now is probably the time in which you should really start looking at. I know a lot of people started looking at it when all of the tariffs from China came out. But even as a made in the USA seller, I think now it could be the time to do that as well. Just, pivot yourself into some of the EU market. It's going to be a little bit smaller than the US, but I think it's good for differentiation and diversification of your entire portfolio. So, in my opinion, huge step forward for both the US and for just sellers in general. It gives a little bit of clarity. We don't have uncertainty around the tariff agreement anymore. We don't know, obviously, if this will change in the future. I'm hoping when they say 15% maximum, that is the maximum, and there is now a way to change this, and we're not going to, step back at any point in time and be like, screw that agreement, we're doing a new one instead. I think this, in my opinion, is a really, really good step for both us and the EU, and it will signify better trade between the two. I guess EU technically is multiple nations, but it'll signify better trade between everyone for the foreseeable future at the very least.